to the Wisconsin School Garden Network webinar on square foot gardening through the curriculum. My name is Stephanie, and I am the outreach specialist, and will be your host and moderator for today. A couple of logistics first as we go along. People might be coming in and out, but if you look at the top of the screen, there is a little chat button that you can hit. So feel free to use this to chat with the panelists or the audience or the audience members. We'll be using this function to be sharing questions. We will do a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to put those in that box and we will answer them at the end. Before we get started, I do want to mention that we'll be offering this webinar for registry credit. So please email me after, and my contact information is on this slide here, and I can get you what you need. We will also be recording this today, so if you have to leave early or want to share this information with your colleagues, I'll be emailing out the recording sometime next week. So without further ado, we'll get started and we can head to the next slide. Great, so a little bit just about the Wisconsin School Garden Network. We were founded in April of 2016, and our vision and our mission is really to improve children's health and well-being by supporting and promoting best practices in garden-based education. This is education not only in school gardens, but also at early care and education sites, after school, and other organizations around the state that are working to support this. Together, we're working to grow this network and overall, again, improve the health of students and children. Well, next slide. So the Wisconsin School Garden Network is a project supported by Community Groundworks and the Environmental Design Lab, and we are funded, our funding is provided by the Wisconsin Partnership Program through the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. So next slide. So kind of getting into the nuts and bolts of what we do. Basically, we offer trainings and free trainings and workshops around the state of Wisconsin. We do webinars such as this one. We also develop and distribute resources. So our website is a great resource for everyone. We have a searchable database that you can go in and search for any sort of subject that you might need, such as composting or getting started with your garden plan. We have a wide variety of resources that will come up. We do have a monthly newsletter that comes out only once a month, and in it we share resources, funding opportunities, and we also are a place that shares stories. So we kind of share best practices that we've found amongst school gardens and gardens at ECE centers across the state. We also do offer technical assistance. So if you're in need of someone maybe to come out to your site, or if you want to have a phone call, if you have maybe garden design questions or how to integrate things into your curriculum, we can provide that service for you. And in the end, our goal is to create connections between schools, organizations, and just create a network of people that are doing this wonderful work. Next slide, please. Again, this is highlighting where you can find those resources on our website. This is our homepage. If you go up into that top right corner, or left corner, sorry, you will see the resource button. You can hit that, and then that will lead you to our searchable database, where again, you can find all sorts of resources on any sort of topic dealing with garden education. Next slide. We are currently running we're at the tail end of our Put Yourself on the Map campaign. Basically, right now we're working to map out all of the school gardens or ECE gardens all across the state of Wisconsin. This is a picture of our map, and it's still growing. And our hope is then to create these connections and establish relationships amongst schools so that we can work together to support the great work that we are doing. Next slide. So without further ado, I would love to hand this over to Veronica. She is at UW River Falls, and she is our regional coordinator for the Northwest region for the Wisconsin School Garden Network. So go ahead and take it away, Veronica.
Awesome. Well, I'm so happy to talk about how we can use square foot gardening across the curriculum. I must say I got interested in learning more about this topic as I visited some schools last summer and saw that they were utilizing their square foot gardens that they had on their school grounds to help have some kind of innovative teaching practices in the K through 12 school districts. So in my presentation today, I'm going to talk a little bit about square foot gardening in terms of a history of the square foot gardening and what it means to be a square foot gardener. We'll talk a little bit about some benefits of square foot gardening, as well as give you some examples of some square foot gardening plans. And then kind of the meat of what we're going to be talking about today is going to be talking about the example square foot gardening curricula that you might be able to use in your education platform. So a little bit about square foot gardening. Square foot gardening was a term that was coined by Mel Bartholomew, and some records indicate that this was started as early as 1975 by Mel. Mel and his colleagues at the Square Foot Gardening website and publishing company have published several books about square foot gardening. There are several versions or editions of the Square Foot Gardening platform. And also he published some books about square foot gardening with kids, as well as some specific lesson plans for square foot gardening. So the Square Foot Gardening website is a great resource for some of those books and videos and training sessions that are offered through the company that was started by Mel. And so the idea of why square foot gardening was started by Mel and then carried forward by others is that square foot gardening creates a method for us to increase productivity of gardens in very small spaces. And so the goal of the square foot gardening platform is to eliminate extra space in the garden by planting fairly close together in a gridded format, and also to try to place those gardens physically close to homes or buildings so that that might support the frequent use of the garden. And so that kind of idea of small spaces, efficient use of the space, and placement of a garden very close to a school or a building seems like it's a very good fit for us to try to introduce this kind of model in our curriculum. So what is square foot gardening? As I mentioned, square foot gardening is a gridded system, and it primarily uses raised beds. So those raised beds may be varying in size from 4 by 4 feet to 4 by 12 feet. And the gridded system, as is mentioned in the name, is based on a square foot system. So each grid or square within this platform is typically 12 inches by 12 inches. The gridded system is typically created by using materials such as string or wire or PVC or wooden lathe, or as you can see in the image on the left-hand side, some people have become pretty innovative in the gridding system they create, and even have integrated irrigation piping into their square foot system to allow them to kind of have the grid system while also providing some water to the plants that they have in their garden. Another premise of square foot gardening based on Mr. Bartholomew's system is to utilize a planting medium, which is sometimes referred to as Mel's mix. This is not a requirement of doing square foot gardening, but this mixture was heavily promoted in the books and other publishings that him and his group came out with. And typically this mix involves a 1-to-1 ratio of peat moss, vermiculite, and compost. And the idea of creating this mixture is that it provides the right combination of nutrients, the ability to hold water, and provide some aeration or air to the plant root system as it's developing. The idea of also using this premix or this mixture is that we try to avoid using soil that might be contaminated with other things, such as heavy metals, and also try to avoid utilizing soils that might be prone to having weed seeds or other things in them that would make it harder for us to be successful growing our plants. Although it is possible to create this mixture yourself by purchasing the individual ingredients, you can actually buy this mix pre-made for yourself if that facilitates you having a garden. Another key feature of square foot gardening is that the gridded pattern is going to be, or the amount of plants that go in each square in the square foot garden is going to be determined by the plant size. And so as you can see here in this image, there are many kind of diagrams that can help gardeners or teachers think about how many plants they will be able to plant in each square foot of their square foot garden. So you can see here that smaller plants typically will be planted at 9 or 16 plants within a square foot, while larger plants may only have 1 or 2 plants within that square foot within a gridded system. The other thing to consider about the square foot garden is that it has some flexibility to it. So although it is pretty common to have a 4x4 grid system where you have about 16 squares in a 4x4 bed, you can also modify the garden for special needs. So there are some examples of smaller gardens, which might be better for preschools or smaller children. So a smaller bed system that's modified for square foot gardening might allow smaller children to reach further across the bed. And typically in these systems, if they're used for the preschool aged group, might utilize larger seeds or planting materials that are easier for small hands to manage. So maybe not planting things like carrots or small herb seeds, maybe focusing more on things like peas or corn seeds, which are easier for those small hands to grab a hold of. We also have the ability, using a square foot gardening platform, not just to have raised beds that are located on the soil surface, but also to create modifications that might allow for other groups to have accessibility. So there are abilities to create, or there are options to create these square foot gardens on raised tables or beds that have been raised up from the ground further, as you can see in this image. And again, you can see here that this bed is only a 2x4 bed, which again would allow better accessibility for smaller children, or maybe someone in a wheelchair wouldn't be able to reach as far across than a larger bed. The square foot gardening platform also allows for some portability. So because the beds typically are only 6 to 12 inches in depth, that allows some portability in terms of moving them if you have a base to the garden. And also you have the ability to grow lots of plants that might need to be trellised, because there are many options to attach a trellising system to the square foot gardening platform. Square foot gardens aren't just for the summertime, so there are a lot of options to utilize square foot gardening in succession planting. So basically extending our season by having a variability of planting dates throughout the whole season, as well as providing square foot gardens or building square foot garden covers that allow us to have season extension, which would be really useful for the Wisconsin climate that we are a part of, and would allow schools in this area to better have produce for their classroom in the fall season, as well as earlier in the spring. So these are a lot of the benefits of square foot gardening in terms of having some flexibility and adaptability to using the garden in lots of different educational platforms. I just wanted to go through some kind of examples of maybe some themes. Typically, themed gardens work pretty well in an educational platform because it helps students see some connections between the plants that they're growing. And sometimes those connections can be further highlighted in maybe history lessons or nutrition lessons, or lessons in cooking and things like that. So one example of a square foot gardening platform is a pretty classic example of companion planting that we see in a lot of different garden programs. And so for those of you that are not familiar with this gardening method of the Three Sisters, this is a planting system that is utilized by a lot of indigenous communities, which basically involves the efficient use of space by combining 3 different plants. So generally these 3 different plants are going to be corn, beans, and squash. And what's pretty cool about this planting is that you get to see how the different plant shapes and plant growth habits of these plants work together. So typically what happens in the Three Sisters system, at least for a square foot gardening platform, is that we plant the corn first. That corn provides a nice upright trellising system, essentially, to allow us to grow climbing beans, which tend to be planted next. And then we fill in the ground level with things like squash that basically have a vining habit that grows on the surface of the garden. And so this is a platform that can be used in all types of gardens, but it does lend itself pretty well to a square foot garden in that we don't need to really take up a lot of space. with a square foot garden, and we still can get all these different plant materials that are growing. And as I mentioned, it does have kind of a historical premise in terms of its historical use for a lot of indigenous communities. Another kind of cool garden to think about, or garden theme to think about, is trying to use square foot gardens for different types of foods that students tend to like. So there are examples of pie gardens or lettuce or salad gardens. And here's another great example of a pizza garden. And so in this case, it's not that we're planting, you know, some unique types of vegetables, but trying to utilize the garden to show how all these raw ingredients can be used to create a food product that students probably have seen outside of school and really enjoy, can be useful. So in this case, of course, we're going to utilize our square foot garden to create some tomatoes that we can, or grow some tomatoes that we can use for tomato sauce, as well as onions and basil and spinach and peppers, which can be used as toppings. The only recommendation for this garden is probably not to actually try to grow the wheat that you would use to make pizza crust, as that might be a pretty difficult process in terms of growing the plant and then trying to use it to actually make a flour for the crust. Another garden I think is pretty interesting and may be used in combination with other plants that are desirable by your students is something I call a hidden treasures garden. And so I call this a hidden treasures garden because in this format, we're going to try to emphasize using root crops. And so root crops, of course, like the carrots you see here on the right, or the bed here on the left where potatoes have been dug. For most of the season, these plants, you know, present themselves as traditional green plants. And it's not until the end of the season where we harvest and dig these plants up that we see the treasures that are hiding below in the soil. And so this can be pretty exciting for students to kind of see that there's a lot of life and color that exists below the soil, and their eyes, you know, can't see it until the end of the season. And so one thing that I really like about the square foot gardening platform is that it does create this kind of structure or gridded system so that you have the ability probably to choose any combination you want. The only recommendation I would provide about this is to try to, when you're thinking about your combination of plants you're going to grow, really do try to follow some of the planting density guidelines that you can find at the Square Foot Gardening website or at other websites on the internet that really do help make sure that you ensure that you're planting the right amount of seeds within your square foot. So here's just an example again of how kind of the plant size is going to indicate the number of plants that we really will be successful growing within that square foot gardening platform. The other thing that might be useful to help you be successful in planting your square foot garden is to try to utilize some sort of template. And so you can purchase templates online, such as this seeding square, which is shown here, which really is meant to help you plant all the different planting densities that you saw on the previous slide in terms of 1, 4, 9, or 16 seeds within that square foot. And then as you can see in the picture on the left, an item like this typically comes with what we call like a divot maker, which allows us to create a hole the right size for the seed and the right depth for the seed to allow us to be the most successful. It's not required to buy one of these seeding squares to be successful. There are many methods that you can find online that help children understand the planting pattern. As well as you can utilize or make templates on your own using wood that you drill holes into to make a template, or in some cases, you can even use something like a muffin tin to create equal spacing between all the plants and making sure you have the right planting density for your square foot garden. So I've given you a little bit of a background about kind of the history of square foot gardening and some of the benefits of square foot gardening and some of the kind of options you have with designing a square foot garden. I want to move on to kind of the focus of this presentation, which is to kind of help you think about brainstorming ideas of how you could use this gridded garden platform to help you strengthen curriculum you might already have at your school, or might help you expand the curriculum you have so that it can be brought into the garden. And so the list of topics I'm going to go through are by no means all the topics that basically you could cover in a square foot garden, but I'm just going to try to present a couple ideas that I think are of particular interest, and just noting that there's probably unlimited opportunities for you to to develop curriculum that's related to the square foot garden. So I'll go over some examples of how math can be incorporated into the square foot garden, some concepts of art that might fit well with the square foot gardening platform, writing examples that might be well suited for square foot gardening, some science examples which tend to be kind of the mainstay of what we might think is happening in a garden, as a lot of the science topics we might be covering are related to plants in some cases, and then maybe some ideas of how maybe maybe non-traditional topics might be covered, or at least be utilized in a square foot gardening platform. So since the square foot gardening platform is based on a gridded system, it's got a very strong structure to it. It makes sense that this will provide an excellent opportunity for students to practice measuring skills or graphing techniques. And this can be utilized, these techniques can be utilized in all different parts of the garden planning process, such as the plant spacing differences, designing the garden. As you can see, there are lots of garden planners that you can get online that can help students plan and think about kind of the math that goes into making sure you have enough plants to make what you want to make, or have enough space to grow all the plants that you want to grow. And in addition to this, other math skills that we can utilize would include collecting data, such as heights of plants or weights of the produce that you're going to harvest at the end of the season. And for more advanced math students, you can even think about how the produce that you're going to harvest, you could use some of the weight data that you collect or the number of fruit that you collect to kind of extrapolate, to think about how you could answer questions such as, how many pies can we make from the pumpkins that we produced in our garden? Or maybe how many pieces of pizza could we make from the tomatoes that were produced in our garden? And so there are a lot of templates, again, online that can help you think about how you could have a framework to promote some of these math skills by using the garden. Because the square foot gardening platform does have these different planting densities, it seems like a really nice relationship that we could develop talking about fractions in the square foot garden. And so with this gridded system, right, with all these different planting densities, it becomes pretty easy to see how a student might be able to visualize how 1/9, right, might be different than 1/4, and that this difference in plant size and difference in space, right, of 1/9 and 1/4 is something that's very visual and tangible. The other thing that you can try to utilize in terms of fractions that might relate with kind of math curriculum is the equivalency of fractions, right? So if you look at the little square foot that's down in the bottom right hand of this garden here, you can see that there are 9 lettuce plants. And so it's pretty easy to visualize how 3/9 might be the same as 1/3. And so for some students where fractions might be maybe an abstract concept, being able to come out to the garden and kind of utilize fractions with these plant materials might be really useful for your students. Because square foot gardens, again, rely on this gridded platform, this allows us to have these discrete kind of blocks within our garden where we can change up lots of things that might relate to art and design topics, such as color, texture, form, balance, symmetry. And so although we might really think that utilizing color is something that's really associated with ornamental plants like petunias or zinnias or coleus plants, because they have so many color variations and texture variations, we do have a lot of variability in some of our new varieties of vegetables, such as kale and lettuce and spinach and basil, which would also provide us the same opportunity to help students explore how changing of the different styles of those plants could allow us to think about these ideas of kind of complementary colors or the hue of colors, or again, thinking about these ideas of texture and balance. And so even in an edible garden platform, we still could try to integrate some ideas of design and art into our square foot garden. The other thing that I thought would kind of be interesting too is for maybe more advanced students is that many of our plants produce pretty dark pigments, and that we could try to utilize our square foot garden to create or grow plants that might be able to be utilized to extract pigments for other art projects, or allow us to create plant-made dyes from. So things such as onions or turmeric roots are great examples of plants that can provide natural food colors or colors that we can use for art projects. So beyond just the design of the garden to influence or enforce art concepts, we also can maybe extract things from the garden to utilize in art projects. Writing can also be a great topic to integrate into all gardens, but in this case for a square foot gardening platform, some ideas that I had for integrating writing would be trying to reinforce some concepts of technical writing. So here are some examples of some garden planning worksheets that, of course, are utilized to help provide instructions for other students or other members of the community to think about how the square foot garden on someone's school grounds might have been planned. And that this can really help students think about detail-oriented writing as they think about kind of the major steps and the process of how they planned their class's garden. Writing doesn't have to be strictly technical though. There are great examples of wonderful garden journals that help students combine a lot of different kind of aspects of creativity. So here's a great example of a garden journal that integrates things such as photos and plant tags, drawings, poetry, fiction that can be related to the garden. And so, you know, trying to integrate a garden journal into your square foot garden is a great way for students to try to develop their writing skills while also focusing on creativity. I also think too about how the garden is changing every day. And so a journal about a garden provides a great way for students to think about daily reflections and how the garden is growing and they may be growing as well. It seems pretty logical to think about how a square foot garden would relate to science. And so some examples of square foot gardening that I thought might be useful for science include a lot of comparisons. So you could design your square foot garden platform to focus on differences in the life cycles of plants. So do these plants really like cold temperatures, such as your peas, or do they really like warm temperatures, such as something like corn? And so you can utilize that platform to kind of help students think about comparisons of what climate plants like to grow best in. The gridded system also allows us to maybe divide the garden into what we would call different supermarket botany categories. So this would be a great opportunity for you to talk with students about what part of the plant do you eat. So having a garden, square foot gardening system that includes things like tomatoes so we can show that the fruit is what we eat, or spinach to show that we eat the leaves, or carrots to show that we eat the roots, or celery to show that we eat some of the stem-like tissue of those plants can be really useful for students. One example that you can see here is there are two broad categories of plants called grasses and broadleaves. And so here in this example, you can see how something like an onion, which is kind of like a grass-like plant, is going to grow and develop differently than something like a carrot, which is what we consider to be a broadleaf plant. We can also use comparisons of kind of plant anatomy and how the plant grows by looking at plant shape and growth and development. So trying to incorporate different plants like climbing plants or vining plants with plants that are more like bush-like. So combining things like cucumbers with beans will be a great way for you to demonstrate to students how plants grow differently and why those different growth habits might benefit those plants in the environment that they're growing in. Another aspect that we can try to focus on in a square foot gardening platform because of the gridded system is to think about the best way to create kind of companion planting systems in this gridded format. And so, you know, good examples of these companion planting systems, of course, are things like planting dill with cabbage, or lettuce with marigolds, or broccoli with basil, or cucumbers with a flowering plant called nasturtium. And this is a great opportunity to talk with students about what an ecosystem is and how having these complementary purposes of these different plants, such as providing shelter to other plants or support to other plants, or promoting the soil health of this system, or trying to incorporate or invite beneficial insects to come into the system. Talking about all these relationships of how choosing different plants to fit together and how that fit can help us create benefits across the garden can be a really useful way to utilize the square foot gardening platform. Another way that we can try to utilize square foot gardens in science is by choosing specific plants that might highlight certain aspects of our senses. And so here's an example of a square foot garden, which is planted into all herbs, which again are going to have kind of different textures, different smells, and different tastes, and obviously look different. And so beyond kind of the human health and nutritional aspects of these different plants and how we might be able to integrate them into a cooking lesson or something like that, we certainly can utilize these plants to talk about what our senses are, right? So how does this plant look different than the other plants? How does the feel of this sage with all of its texture feel different than the smooth parsley plant? Why does the smell of this plant smell different to us? And this can even be brought into a more advanced kind of science class. As some of these plant compounds, it's very interesting why they might be very similar in terms of their chemical structure, but may smell very, very different to us because of how that chemical smell interacts with our nose, right? So talking about some of the human anatomy aspects of why plants, why we interact with plants differently based on how they interact with our senses. So there's lots of great examples here of how we can kind of bridge across different topics in the curriculum by using plants in a square foot gardening platform as our kind of centerpiece. And then last but not least, some things that we might think are not necessarily defined by a particular aspect of our curriculum are still very integral to the gardening process. And so some unique aspects of square foot gardening that you might be able to pull out for some social skills include things like responsibility. And so you could envision having a square foot garden. In this case, it's a 9 gridded system. And so maybe you could have 9 students and each person gets a grid or a square in the square foot gardening to manage themselves. And so it teaches the students some responsibility in terms of their responsibility to plant this seed and water this seed and take care of this seed as it's growing. You also could see how maybe these gridded gardens could be divided up into pairs, which would help reinforce some teamwork skills as students work together to plan out how their square is going to be planted and watered and how it's going to be maintained and then ultimately harvested. Another neat thing, again, is that this gridded system allows us to kind of create this idea of a boundary. And so although we want to encourage teamwork in all cases, it's sometimes nice to kind of show that we each can have something that we care for and that we should be respectful of that space that we each have. And so, I think you can think of a lot of different kind of social skills that can be integrated into other curriculum. So you kind of get a synergistic effect of bringing your students into the square foot gardening platform. So with that, this is kind of all I have in terms of material to talk about today, but I do hope that those of you that are present for the webinar do feel free to ask any questions you might have about using square foot gardening across the curriculum.
We can kind of give a little bit of time too if people have questions coming in. One question I know I had, Veronica, was are there certain materials that you found best to creating? I noticed in a couple of those photos, there were PVC piping, there was wood. Are there other ideas for materials that you can use to create that kind of grid-like system for square foot gardening?
Yes. So, I mean, of course, the idea of using something like string is nice because it's the lowest cost of probably all the materials. It provides a lot of flexibility so that at the end of the season, you can easily pick up that string. And then if you need to do something like do some tillage in this garden bed or clean up all the debris or things like that, the string is really nice because it is so easy. It's temporary in many cases. A lath structure is going to be a little bit more expensive, especially if you build it out of something like cedar, which would probably be desirable because of its durability and also the fact that it's not really treated with the same types of chemicals that maybe your pressure treated wood would be. However, the ability to cut those strips and secure those strips with screws, you may not work so well for some school garden platforms. And then again, the ability to move them at the end of the year is a little bit more tedious. However, they're a more permanent option and they're less likely to get cut or broken in different situations. And so they can provide a more permanent situation for the gardening. PVC is nice in some cases because it is pretty durable. You do need to have a special cutter to cut PVC pipe, but it can be nice too because you don't get splinters from PVC, which you could potentially get from wood. And so again, thinking about who your audience is, I really did think that was a creative way to kind of have irrigation in a grid, which I showed on one of the first slides. And so basically that would involve some tubing that has different perforations in it that allow a small stream of water to come out every inch or so. And then that pipe basically, or that tubing basically was connected with some copper tees basically, or copper with 4 openings in it that allows you to have that grid pattern that you can create with the cut tubing.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Those are some great ideas. I know I've always been interested in starting a square foot garden, and maybe this year will be the year. So great. Well, I don't know if we have any other questions from the audience, but I know that our emails are on this last slide. So if you do have questions, you are more than welcome to email either of us with any sort of things. We also, like I mentioned before, this is available for registry credit. So here's my email again. I'll also be putting a link to, if you're interested in signing up to our newsletter, where we do share, I know I've been sharing a couple different resources here about square foot gardening. But if you are interested in signing up for our newsletter, again, that goes out monthly. I'm putting a link into the chat right now, and you can just click that to sign up for the newsletter. So unless there's anything else, I want to thank you all for your time. Veronica, if you have anything else to add.
Well, I just want to thank you for your time as well. And I hope that you find some new ideas to maybe integrate it into a square foot garden that you already have, or it might consider developing a raised bed that you already have into making it a square foot garden.